has popped back in. Rob,
I
are
can
you
go for it if the internet gods will allow me. If I break up, just continue wherever I end off. Okay.
okay? It sounds good. Go for it.
All right. Erica Matthews received her BSA in Pre-Professional Animal Science in 2019, her Master's of Research in Primate Biology, Behavior, and Conservation in 2021, and is a fourth-year doctoral candidate in Biological Anthropology. She currently studies sexual dimorphism, I had to look that up, in Miocene apes. I also had to look up Miocene, I must say. The group which directly precedes and succeeds the split between humans and chimpanzees. And I hope I got that right. It's 23 to 5 million years ago. Is that right, Eric? Yeah. So Eric is also a science communicator on YouTube under the moniker Gutsick Gibbon, and I'd love to ask where that moniker came from, where she explains the latest discoveries concerning human evolution and spends a copious amount of time debunking pseudoscientific topics from creationism to cryptozoology. And I will add that she's also fond of doing marathon sessions with Forrest Valkai on shows on the line. Welcome to RfRx, Erica.
Hello, I'm glad to be here. I hope you guys will bear with me as I unload a lecture onto you that hopefully you will enjoy.
Oh, I know we'll
Oh
enjoy it.
man.
Rob and I will enjoy
Oh
it.
yeah.
I have a feeling our audience will too. You give really good presentations, and I
I hope so.
cannot wait.
I hope so. The way that I've structured this is there is a lot of information, but it's the kind of presentation that I would have really liked to have seen when I was first getting into this. So, my hope is to provide sort of a bird's eye view of human evolution, what we are and how we got here, with a little bit of history and a little bit of comparative morphology, which I know everybody loves just as much as I do, and a little bit of like taking a little stroll through our evolutionary history as we understand it right now, because as we all know, science is subject to change. That's the best part about science, is that it's always provisional. It is its greatest strength. So I'm hoping to give you guys the story as we know it now, and with a caveat that things always might change in the future.
Well,
And a
I
reminder to folks watching live, if people in the future are hearing it, they already know this because they found it on the internet, but this will become a YouTube video. So you can watch it, rewatch it, slow it down, rewind it to get all the good information.
Sweet.
yeah, so feel free to jump into it whenever you're ready, Erica.
Right. Okay, cool. I'm just going to jump into it then. So I've titled my presentation here tonight, Gentle and Modern Apes, a brief evolutionary history of what we are and how we got here. And I almost put an asterisk after that gentle, because when I introduce myself to my YouTube subscribers, I usually start by saying, hello, my gentle, and of course, very modern apes, because that's two things that humans, at the very least, one of those things that we are, and one of those that we can be. We're all very modern apes, and gentle is sort of up for debate. And as we're going to discuss a little bit, here today, that's in part because of where we came from. Our apish heritage has, we owe it for many of our positive and of our negative characteristics. What you can see in the background here is a graphic that I made myself because I was sick and tired of everybody reusing the same Talk Origins picture that shows the evolution of humans from ancient hominins. And a hominin is any critter that's more closely related to humans than it is to our last common ancestor with chimpanzees. So we're the only surviving hominins today. We're going to be talking about a lot of hominins that we used to share the world with, and indeed some that we came from. Now, this picture in the background is an updated version of that Talk Origins one, so no shit on Talk Origins, of course, but, it's got us all the way from Sahelanthropus chilensis 7 million years ago, who we'll meet shortly, all the way to anatomically modern Homo sapiens there on the bottom right. So, a little bit to get us started here, who am I? Who am I to be talking to you about this? I got my BSA in pre-professional animal science from University of Arkansas. You guys all already heard this, but, as a background, I was going to be a veterinarian. That was pre-veterinary track, took a ton of chemistry, took a ton of physics, took a ton of biochem, didn't get to take as much biology as I wanted, which is something that I rectified in my master's degree. But I worked at a veterinary clinic, and I realized that that's actually a real bummer of a job for someone who loves animals. So thank your vets. Their job is very difficult. There's a lot of sick animals that come in, and that kind of sucks. So I sort of pivoted at that point and thought, okay, well, what am I interested in? And I recalled this trip that I'd gone on when I was an undergraduate to Tanzania, where part of it was going to Gombe Stream National Park, which is where Jane Goodall did her work, and I got to meet chimpanzees in the wild there, which was very formative for me. And when I was looking around for master's programs, I found one out of University of Roehampton, London. It was a master's of research in primate biology, behavior, and conservation. So I applied, I got in, I went over there, got my master's of research. And then I decided to pursue a PhD in biological anthropology because human evolution rocks my socks off. I love it. I think it's the coolest thing ever. Honestly, to me, the more interesting part is like right on that cusp of where things are debatable, whether it is or it isn't a human, which is why I study the time period I study. More on that in a minute. But most of you probably don't know me from any of that stuff because I have not published my master's research yet, and so I don't have an academic footprint. If you know me at all, you probably know me from YouTube, where I do science communication on the Gutsick Gibbon channel. Gibbons are my favorite primates, and so I called myself Gutsick Gibbon on an old Reddit account many, many years ago, well before I'd even made my YouTube channel. And so when I transitioned into doing YouTube video content, I was like, well, I'll just, I want people to remember, who I am. So I just pulled the, the Reddit username over and, my alliteration.
And where did the gut sick part come from? Were you just sick that day that you came up with the name?
So gibbons are, like I said, gibbons are my favorite ape. They're my favorite animal in general. We'll talk about why here in a little bit, but I'm an artist as well, a total amateur, but I do like to draw. And I'd drawn a cartoon of a gibbon drinking tea with an upset stomach the day that I made the Reddit username.
Aha.
When we make our usernames, we don't think that they're going to be our forever names. So I was like, that's a gibbon. It's just a Reddit username. It's not like I have to stick with it forever. But I'm actually very fond of it now, so it's sort of grown on me. But you can see some pictures there of me interacting with various critters. On the upper left, that's me with a Barbary macaque, Macaca sylvanus. And on the upper right, that's me with a very large stick arthropod that is crawling on me to my delight and chagrin. And then at the bottom, that's me. I'm in the sort of salmon-colored shirt at the bottom, playing the role of our most primitive hominin, doing the March of Progress with a couple of my fellow students. This was actually on that Tanzania trip that I told you guys about earlier. And what's cool about that March of Progress is that was taken in Olduvai Gorge, which is a famous Eastern African hominin site where we find a whole bunch of type specimens from a bunch of fossils there. So cool stuff. But enough about me. I'm giving you guys a talk today about us and about our relatives that are still around and about the relatives that are no longer here with us. I'm asking this question, how do we come to know ourselves as gentle and modern apes? And, that's just me sticking my catchphrase in there. How do we come to know ourselves as apes, right? Like, what is an ape? Why are we considered apes? And do we have support from science to say that we descend from other apes? Because this is an idea that is, on the grand scheme of things, quite new, because science is quite new. And I want to talk a little bit about this story through a couple of different mediums. I want to ask, how did the science advance us to get to this point? What exactly makes us apes? And why did we become the type of ape that we are today? Because as you can see, hopefully from that phylogenetic tree there at the bottom that shows, the human relationship with some of our closest relatives, the panins, which are chimpanzees and bonobos, gorillans, which are of course the gorillas, orangutans, and gibbons, why are we weird? Because we are kind of weird. All apes are weird in their own ways, but we're humans and we like to ask the question, what makes us weird? And why does this matter at all? What's the point? Why should we have these conversations about what we are and where we came from? Is there utility in that? So what on earth are we? I'm going to start us off with a little bit of history, because answering the question, like, what is a human? It depends on who you're asking and where you're asking and when you're asking. But I think, in my experience, you can lump that question, answers to that question, after humans, started writing down the answer to this question, into two general pools. The first is special creation. What we are is something that is unique, something that is divinely endowed, something that is above all other regular old life on Earth. And you can trace this back to, even non-Western Christian ideas from Plato and his student Aristotle, who had this idea of essentialism and scala natura, right? The scale of nature where inanimate objects are at the bottom, and then really basic animals, and then more advanced animals. Then there's humans, and then above humans is like the gods and the angels and things like that. And I'll note here that most religions also hold to this idea of special creation, that whatever we are, it's different, it's distinct, and there is a discrete barrier that exists between us and everything else, at least everything else that's on the mortal plane. And you can summarize this by saying, we are apart from nature. But typically, we tend to characterize this idea that we are a part of nature, this idea of evolution and unity with the rest of life on Earth, is this totally brand new idea. And while understanding evolution, like most science in general, is newer, is on the newer end of human discovery, it's not totally new to propose that humans have this continuity with the rest of life. Anaximander was a Greek who proposed, fascinatingly enough, that humans descend from fish, which I had no idea that anybody had ever proposed that, like, before basically the scientific revolution. But he looked at fish and he looked at the natural world, and he had this idea of wanting to explain things using empiricism, which was this idea that was sort of up and coming at the time. And he was like, well, if we share a lot with fish, and why not, right? Like, organisms are seem like they're always changing. And so he proposed this idea and got, BTFO'd by Plato and Aristotle, because it turns out coming from a fish is a less sexy idea than saying that we are divinely created creatures from the gods. Um, Zhuao Zong as well argued that humans have this continuity with the rest of nature, out in Asia, which is naturally these guys have less of a sort of special creation idea, because there are many different types of religions that are coming at this from many different perspectives. And he proposed that nature is always changing, right? This is classic from a Taoist perspective, that everything is in flux. So why not humans? And if organisms can change, then why are we to suppose that humans are the only things that are static? And as well is from the Baghdad House of Wisdom, Ibn Khaldun, who proposed that humans actually come from the world of the monkeys. That's like a quote from him, which is pretty cool. And I want to make a note here that I don't think I've really seen anybody else point out, which is that it seems to me like the people who are more willing to look at the continuity of humans with other life are the people who lived in areas where primates live, where other primates, other non-human primates live, right? Like, there are no monkeys living in Greece, or any really in Europe, except for in Gibraltar, where you've got those Barbary macaques. But in Asia and in some areas of the Middle East, you've got these native monkeys that are living there. And I think that people looked at monkeys and they were like, how can you not see the resemblance, right? Like, there's a similarity here, there's a familiarity here. And so it's a lot harder to discreetly separate humans out from everything else when some of the closest relatives are right there in your face all the time, usually messing with you. So, all of this changes, though, and really hits sort of a speed boost here when we hit the scientific revolution. So the Western world is staying relatively consistent. I'm going to focus on the Western world because that's where I live, and that's what I'm most familiar with. But special creation is the name of the game until the scientific revolution, when humans are beginning to look up at the stars and look down at the earth beneath our feet, and we're beginning to look in the mirror as well and ask, what are we, and where are we, and how long have we been here? And is this like a flat plane that we're standing on, or is it like a ball rotating through space and time? And like, how long has all of this been happening? And are we discrete truly from the rest of the animal kingdom, or are we not? Um, and there is just a ton of history here that I could get into. I'm going to make a couple of points on some small observations that I think are really big game changers before we get into like what actually makes us an ape, because it was these guys and gals that made these observations and sort of put this on people's radar. For a long time, I gave credit to like the first person who was like, maybe humans are like grouped with the rest of these apes, to Carlos Linnaeus, right, the father of taxonomy. But it was actually Edward Tyson in the 1600s, before Linnaeus, who was this British anatomist, and he like happened upon this opportunity to dissect a chimpanzee. And he was looking at the chimpanzee, and he was trying to categorize all the characteristics of this chimp. And at the end of it, he writes it up, he publishes it. You can see a picture that he drew and put into that book there at the top. And he's like, humans are very, very similar to these apes, to these pygmy chimpanzees. They just called them generic pygmies at the time, which isn't a term that we use anymore. But he was like, actually, it's so uncanny that chimpanzees share more with humans than they do with monkeys. And he took that even to the degree of looking at the brain, which was totally scandalous at the time, because at the very least, the thing that was supposed to separate humans from everything was our minds. And here was Edward Tyson, even before Linnaeus, saying, no, I can't see a big difference there. And I've looked really closely. And he was this pretty lauded anatomist. And so, that was in the background when Linnaeus starts stepping up and looking at all of life. So for those who don't know, Linnaeus is considered the father of taxonomy. And taxonomy is this way by which we categorize life. It's how we categorize things into that old classic scheme: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Linnaeus was the guy who did all that. And he got into some trouble, and he was writing about it to one of his friends, because when he was trying to categorize life initially, he has this wonderful quote where he's like, I can't think of a single reason not to place humans with these other man-like animals, what he called anthropomorpha. And he's like, I'm going to get in trouble with these theologians, but if I'm doing this scientifically, there's no way to do this. There's no way to separate humans out. And so he comes to the conclusion that being made in the image of God must be something spiritual, and he elevated the other apes up to the human level and called the whole thing anthropomorpha. And things are all fine and dandy with that in mind, because Linnaeus is thinking to himself, I'm categorizing life just like Adam did with the animals in the Garden of Eden: no harm, no foul. And this is just common design, right? Like, no, it's no big deal. He's like, I'm not saying, we're at the level of these creatures. I'm just saying we share a lot with them physically because God designed it that way. And very hot off the presses was Archbishop Usher's chronology of the age of the earth, which he used the Bible to count up as being approximately 6,000 years old. And Usher actually proposed that Earth was created on a very specific date, October 23rd, like in the evening, like about 6,002 years ago. So he was very precise. And all of that starts to change when James Hutton starts paying attention. So James Hutton starts looking around, and he's this young geologist. And all of these gentlemen naturalists, like, you weren't really a geologist, you were a gentleman naturalist. You were a rich guy with a lot of time on his hands. And Hutton starts paying a lot of attention to geological formations. And in doing so, he happens on Hadrian's Wall, right? This old Roman wall that was created in the UK. And he looks at it and he's like, okay, this is a little bit problematic, because I know when Hadrian's Wall was built because we have the historical records for that. And yet, this thing is not eroded like at all. And I know that these surrounding mountains were there when the Romans built Hadrian's Wall, so they must be substantially older. And we know erosion happens, and we know that it's evidently happening quite slow. And so, Hutton sticks back and he's like, guys, Earth is not 6,000 years old. And he's one of the guys who starts to sort of softly pitch this idea of uniformitarianism, that the Earth is changing, and it's changing very, very slowly, and has been doing so for a very long time. In that same vein is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who's a Frenchman who's doing the same thing, but for biology. And he's looking at life, and he's saying, well, it's not just the rocks that have been changing for a long time, but the organisms that dwell upon them. But unlike Hutton, who got kind of passed with his idea, in particular because people found a way to cram a whole lot of geologic time in between Genesis 1 verse 1 and Genesis 1 verse 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Who knows how much time was there before God starts creating things on terra firma? So people were like, okay, well, we can make this work. But Lamarck comes in and he's like, species are changing. And people did not like that at all, because they were like, well, God says he creates things after their kind. Species don't change. Species are fixed. And so they absolutely lambasted Lamarck. And Lamarck ends up dying penniless, and kind of disgraced, because he proposed this idea that species can change over time, specifically using this kind of outdated, but also in a roundabout way, not outdated idea that we change because of characteristics that we acquire during our lives. So he argued, that a giraffe could stretch its neck just a little bit further to get to the tops of the acacia trees, and then its neck would get a tiny bit longer, and then it would pass those characteristics on to its offspring, and over time you get giraffes with longer necks. We know that that's not how it works for the most part, but the field of epigenetics has sort of caused us to look back and say, well, maybe Lamarck had a little bit right. Around that same time, George Cuvier and Mary Anning really changed the game, because they start finding impossible monsters in the ground. And no one knows what to make of them, right? Like, Mary Anning lives off the coast of Dorset, and she's looking, in these areas, picking around in these limestone cliffs, and she's finding the bones of animals that are frightful and do not exist anymore. And Cuvier, at the same time, is cataloging these types of organisms elsewhere, including hearing about big giant's teeth coming from the United States, from a place called Big Bone Lick in Kentucky. And it turns out, they're mammoth and mastodon teeth. And funnily enough, Cuvier actually feuded with Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson was totally convinced that nothing can go extinct, which is the term Cuvier coined to say, organisms go away forever and they don't come back. You can kill off every single last critter belonging to a species on the face of the earth. And Jefferson was like, I couldn't conceive of that. He was like, nature would never let that happen. And because of that, he actually warned people who are taking these expeditions out west because he was so convinced that those mastodons were still out there. But Cuvier and Marianning, their work specifically reveals this past to the people of these primordial creatures that used to exist that don't exist anymore. And Cuvier coins the term catastrophism to talk about why these organisms aren't here. And he says, these great catastrophes have happened through the history of Earth, and they wipe out these organisms. And so God has to come in and sequentially create along the way. At the same time, Charles Lyell looks at Cuvier's work, and Cuvier, Marianning, Lamarck, basically everybody since Hutton is like, okay, the Earth is probably pretty old, but it isn't until Lyell that people are like, wow, it's not just a little bit old, it's like super old. Because Lyell starts to systematically characterize these geologic formations, and he's doing so in a way that the British loved because it was dry and included a lot of diagrams and very systemic, and so he became sort of the belle of the ball in the London Geological Society and very quickly won people over to this idea of uniformitarianism, this idea that the present is the key to the past, and that we can actually tell the age of formations by looking at how quickly they change in the present. And this really turns up the clock as far as like how old the Earth is potentially going to be, because things are changing very slowly now. And it was actually a copy of Charles Lyell's book, The Principles of Geology, that accompanied a young British naturalist when he took a voyage around the world and changed biology forever. Charles Darwin had a copy of Lyell's text in hand as he went on the voyage of the Beagle. And Darwin is going to be the one that really changes the game from a biological perspective, right? And he sort of resurrects Lamarck's ideas to some degree, but not entirely. Instead, Darwin looks at the world and he makes these observations of organisms that are exceedingly well adapted to their environment. And he's also got a copy of Malthus's papers, or not papers, of essays, excuse me, on population growth and how populations can only get so big, whether we're talking about humans or finches or insects, they're constrained by their resources. Darwin's thinking about this and he's like, okay, if populations are constrained by their resources, then there's going to be competition amongst organisms. And organisms are going to be varied because we all know by observing them that organisms vary. They just do. And they didn't understand genetics, so they didn't have the basis for that. But Darwin was like, we know organisms vary and we know they compete for limited resources, which means that some organisms are going to be better fit in their environments than others. They're going to outcompete their fellows rather, and they're going to reproduce more often and pass those favorable characteristics onto their offspring. And Darwin took that and he had that in mind when he looked at these organisms that were so well adapted to their environment. And he was like, okay, that it's natural selection, right? The environments are what shape the organisms, right? The organisms aren't placed, sort of ex nihilo as if they are made perfectly for their environments. They were made by their environments. And he knows he's got a lot of time because he's got that principles of geology in hand. He comes back, blows the lid off of this thing, and most people are immediately like, duh, that makes so much sense. I can't believe we didn't think of it sooner. He's immediately winning a lot of people over, even though there certainly were clashes, because people immediately knew that Darwin's ideas had implications. Because if they could apply to organisms like finches, who could trace their ancestry back to a common finch, and if they could apply to butterflies, who could trace their ancestry back to a common butterfly, then they could apply to humans. And how far back did that go? And Darwin's idea was that it went back all the way to one or just a handful of last universal common ancestors of everything. And of course, this was sort of bolstered by his friend Thomas Huxley, who was won over by Darwin's ideas very early on and became known as Darwin's bulldog and homed in and focused on this idea of how does this apply to humans, right? He writes Evidence of Man's Place in Nature, which is this whole idea of like, where do humans fit? And his idea was that we fit, as Linnaeus said all those years ago, amongst the apes, as apes who have evolved from other apes. And this is like the sort of basis for this idea of like humans are apes physically. That's what we are. And so like let's sort of take a little stroll down that. Like, what are humans? We exist as critters that occupy successively rather nested categories. We belong to the domain of eukarya because our cells are nucleated. We belong to the kingdom Animalia because we form these hollow tubes of cells called blastulas and we have a cell membrane instead of a cell wall. We belong to the phylum Chordata because we have a ventral heart, a postanal tail, and a notochord and a nerve cord. We belong to the class Mammalia because we have body hair, this special joint called the dentary squamosal joint in our jaws. We have four-chambered hearts, heterodont teeth, so our teeth do different jobs depending on what we need. And we produce milk for our young, amongst other things. But it gets more specific than that because humans are also primates. We have big brains for our body size, these dexterous grasping hands, flexible bodies, binocular color vision, nails instead of claws. And we're also haplorhines because we have these dry noses, these postorbital plates. We don't have a split lip. We can't synthesize our own vitamin C. I'm walking you through all of these, not because I expect you to memorize them, but because I'm trying to emphasize that it's like, we occupy these successfully nested categories because these successfully nested categories exist whether you are or aren't taking humans into consideration, right? All of these categories exist whether you include humans or don't. But once you sort of classify life by these successive groups of similarity, and then you ask, where do humans belong? The answer is within each of these boxes. We're catarrhines. We have these downward facing nostrils with two premolars and these ischial callosities. There's little butt pads that help us sit better. We've actually sort of secondarily lost them, as have the other apes. But I skipped Anthropodia, but we have fused mandibles, a bicornuate uterus, and a single pair of nipples. And you can get more specific than that, right? Like we're walking our way down these categories, getting more specific as we move. We belong to the superfamily Hominoidea, the apes, right? We don't have tails. We have even larger brains for our body sizes than other primates. We have these really mobile shoulders, so we're able to put our arms directly above our heads, right? Like a baboon can't do that, but apes can. We develop super slowly. We have to stay with our parents for a long time to learn about the world around us. We have a Y5 molar pattern, which you can see on the bottom right of your screen there, and short, stiff lower backs. And even more specifically than that, we are hominids or great apes, right? We have an exacerbation of everything that you saw in those hominoids. But in addition to that, we've lost the ischial callosities and we use tools extensively. And I hope you can see that as you look at the pictures on your screen, where you've got like all of these apes that have these characteristics that unite us all together. Characteristics like taking care of our young, using tools. You can see an orangutan there on the bottom that's using a spear to try to spear fish, right? You can see chimpanzees as they crack nuts open with rocks. And you see a gorilla holding a very large stick that she's using to test the depth of the water because gorillas can't swim. So surely though, right, maybe, and this was the trouble that faced all of these sort of gentlemen naturalists as they were encountering this. They're like, okay, maybe humans are physically apes. Maybe we're physically great apes. Maybe we do fit in all of these successive categories. But there's got to be something that sets us apart. Like categorically speaking, there's got to be that divine spark. Maybe it's behavioral, right? Like maybe it's not physically. Maybe, when they say, like, as Linnaeus thought, in his image is something that is spiritual in nature. And maybe that spirituality reflects some behavioral characteristic. Humans today have a ton of characteristics that have been traditionally, ascribed or attributed just to us. We exhibit a theory of mind, the ability to empathize with others. We show compassion and altruism. We can be cruel. We understand justice. We use advanced tools and advanced communication styles. And we have an understanding of death or mortality. So we can ask a question then. Do humans stand apart categorically in any of these traits? Or is it still a difference in degree, right? Because you could say, oh, well, humans differ from chimpanzees in that we have long femurs, but chimpanzees have femurs, right? Or you could say, well, humans differ from chimpanzees in that we have these huge brains. And it's like, yes, but they also have huge brains for their body sizes. We've just dialed it up to 11. Are we looking at a categorical difference, or is it a difference in degree?
So you mentioned theory of the mind. For people who don't know what that means, could you just explain that for just a short bit?
Of course, the theory of mind is the understanding that others' beliefs, desires, intentions, emotions, and thoughts may be different from one's own. It's your ability to know what someone else knows and act upon that, right? And there's been this debate, or there was this debate for a very long time in primatology as to like, okay, we know humans can do this. I think, therefore I am. I can walk downstairs and I can see my husband, pacing around in the kitchen, and I can think, man, he paces when he's hungry, so he's probably hungry, so I'll offer him a snack or something like that. It's like the ability to role take. And we thought that this theory of mind was something that only humans exhibited for a very long time, and had these arguments within the primatological community as to like, okay, is it exclusive to humans? Some people will propose that this argument is still going on. I think that it's done and dusted. I think that we've very robustly supported theory of mind in other primates. We know that chimpanzees will warn other group members selectively of danger. So we've observed chimpanzees walking in the wild, they're walking in a group, and some member at the front of the group will encounter a plastic snake that a researcher's thrown down. And that chimpanzee, chimps hate snakes, so they'll freak out and the chimps will scatter. And then one chimp will wait by that plastic snake to warn group members that they know haven't seen the snake yet. Right. So they're able to say, okay, I'm here and I've seen this and I have this information, but these people who are still walking down the way haven't seen it yet, and I should warn them. They preferentially comfort bereaved mothers, right? So losing a child is something that is, it's one of the most difficult things that an organism can undergo, especially mammals. And chimpanzees and bonobos will preferentially comfort mothers who have miscarried or lost their child. They'll share food with them more often. They'll exhibit reconciliatory behaviors like hugging them, embracing them, and kissing them and stroking their fur. Because they know, right, that it sucks more to lose a child than it does to not lose a child. To put it bluntly, right? But that's what they're doing. That's a very familiar behavior. They mediate fights they weren't involved in, right? So Frans de Waal, a famous late primatologist, he did a ton of work on this in chimps and bonobos, but like good alpha males or good alpha females, they have that high-ranking role, not because they're bullies necessarily, but because they're good at getting group members to get along. So alpha males or alpha females will see that there's been a spat between two other members, and they'll go and try to get them to get back together and like kiss and make up, basically. They mediate these fights. Or if the fight is going on, they'll intervene and be like, okay, stop, we're not doing this anymore. And they know, in perhaps one of the most non-anecdotal and experimental supports for theory of mind, they can provide a group mate with the tool that they need for a task that they're not involved in. So that's what you're looking at on that picture there to the right. Chimpanzee who's reaching through, right, she has to accomplish a task, but chimp one has been given a tool, right, that chimp two needs to accomplish that task. So she's reaching through to say, hey, give me that tool so that I can do the task. And I have a video here to sort of show that. So here's chimp one and chimp two. They're separated by a glass panel. The researcher slides a tool in through, and chimp two is reaching through, and she's like, hey, 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 come on. She's getting her attention. She's saying, clapping her hands, saying, give me that tool. And the first chimp is looking at it and trying to decide whether or not she wants to give the tool to her partner here. Because if the partner completes the task, the partner gets a reward, but the helping chimp doesn't. So if she's helping basically because she's hoping to get a favor later, or because, out of the goodness of her heart. So she's messing around with these tools before she's eventually going to decide to say, okay, is this the tool that you need? The chimp's going to pull it through and accomplish the task, and chimp two is interested enough, so this leans over to watch to see if she successfully accomplishes it. So, this takes a lot of brain power, right, to be able to do. This is something that human toddlers can't really do, right? It's a higher level of cognition than human kids. Humans obviously eventually grow to do it, and we do it very, very well. But this is a super familiar behavior to me. Chimpanzees and bonobos, our other apes, our other great apes, exhibit reconciliation and consolation, right? So what you can see there in the upper left is two chimpanzees who are embracing during a stressful situation. That's super familiar. I see human kids do this. And in the picture to your right, you see a mother chimpanzee whose child has been spooked, and she's reaching out, trying to say, okay, come on, you can come down now. It's okay. There's nothing to be afraid of. Here's a video that shows that as well. These are a bunch of male chimpanzees who have just been involved in a territorial dispute. Everybody's riled up, everybody's freaking out, nobody's having a good time. And so to calm each other down and sort of reconcile the situation, they embrace, because like us, it feels good to be comforted by a friend, by another member of your group. That's empathy, right? If I've ever seen it. The chimpanzee isn't approaching the other one because he wants to feel the other person hug him. He's also doing it because he wants to comfort his group mate. And this is not very difficult to understand from a natural selection point of view either, because if you live in a group where a group has to defend a territory together, which is something that chimpanzees do, they're one of the few other animals, as we'll talk about in a moment, that exhibit warfare that's how far they go when it comes to defending their territory. You have to have good cohesion. If you're a chimpanzee who can't reconcile with other chimps and who can't mediate fights and who can't get along, you're going to get kicked out of the group. So you need to be able to get along and play nice. Of course, reconciliation and compassion has a flip side in chimps, as it does with us. That in-group, out-group behavior can be turned outward and turned outward violently. chimpanzees engage in war, and I say war with intent. That's a loaded word, but that's what it is. In Gombe, Jane Goodall and her team, and then at that field site for many years afterwards, documented this group of chimpanzees who systematically annihilated a neighboring group of chimpanzees and assimilated some of the females into their own group while they were killing, the males anytime they had an opportunity. And they do this by performing these patrols on the edges of their territory, whereby they look for isolated males, which then they will gang up on and torture and kill him. And they don't just kill him; They could just do that, but they don't. They're very cruel in that they bite off fingers and gouge out eyes and rip off testicles and things like that. And that's very familiar, unfortunately, too, to how humans are, right? We don't just kill to get rid of a threat. We kill because we want vengeance, or because we want power, or because we want to feel strong. And sometimes this type of violence in chimpanzees, and I'm focusing on chimps primarily here because one, they're some of our closest living relatives, and two, they're one of the best studied apes outside of humans, of course. They perform coups within their group. So if an alpha male is, and chimpanzees are quite patriarchal, they have an alpha male who ranks at the highest, and then some males who rank lower, and then usually the females and some of the lowest ranking males. But that position is tenuous. So if chimpanzees feel like their alpha male is not performing his duties of mediation and protection properly, sometimes two lower ranking males will conspire to overturn him. And when I say conspire, I mean they actually do conspire. They groom each other preferentially. They hide when they when they see that alpha male coming. And this is to the degree that once a chimpanzee, and this was at I believe it was at Franz de Waal's research station, two lower ranking chimps had overturned the resident male. And later that resident male ended up dying. And so the two who had overturned him, they're enjoying their position of power. And about 2 years later, they've been recording these chimpanzees at this research station for quite some time. The researchers, perhaps a bit cruelly, decided to play the documentary, some of the footage that they'd been taking of these chimpanzees for the chimps to see how they would react. And when Nikki, that old alpha male, came onto the screen, the current alpha male went screaming to his coup partner, like as if he was like, he's back, right? And I'm going to get with my partner so that we can protect our positions. So they do a lot of schmoozing, and they do a lot of retaliation and retribution and politicking. And that's something that's very interesting for chimpanzees because it's so opposite of what we see in our other closest living relative, bonobos, who are comparatively peaceful. They still can be very, very violent, but they're female dominated. So they have an alpha female who ranks above all of the males, and other females also rank above all of the males. And the way that they wield this power is, interestingly enough, collectively. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. These other primates too, and it's not just chimpanzees, they have this conception of fairness and justice as well. Some of you guys have probably seen this because this is a very famous clip. This is a fairness study that Franz de Waal and his team ran on capuchin monkeys. So capuchin monkeys are platyrrhines. They're New World monkeys. They live in Central and South America. They're not as closely related to us as like baboons or macaques are, but these capuchins are pretty intelligent. So you have two females here that are being assessed for fairness, whether or not they understand equal pay. And I think I'm drinking my water there. To tell you sort of what you're about to see, capuchin monkeys are like humans in that they like fruits. They like sweet things a lot. They prefer a grape over a cucumber. And so what's going to happen here is that these capuchins have to perform a task. They're given a rock, and they have to take the rock from the researcher and then give the rock back. And as a reward, they're going to get either a cucumber or a grape. And that capuchin on the left is going to be rewarded with cucumbers, and the capuchin on the right is going to be rewarded with grapes. And I want you to see, how that how that goes down. So here she's given the rock, and Franz de Waal can narrate this a lot better than I can. So she's seen that the other one has gotten a grape as a reward, and now she's hyped up, right? This one on the left, she's like, okay, she's getting a grape for her reward, and so that means I'm probably going to get a grape this time too. So she returns the rock. The researcher gives her her reward of cucumber. She looks at it and she's like, this is bullshit. And she throws it. She's like, how come my partner gets grapes and I get, stupid cucumbers? So they understand that that's not fair and they're mad about it. And what's really cool about this is that, they try it again and again, and it keeps happening. And they've tried this with capuchins who've never done this study before, and the same thing happens. And they've tried it with more intelligent primates as well, chimpanzees. And when this happens in chimpanzees, both chimpanzees quit, like out of solidarity. Like they'll be like, well, we're not going to do this if we're not getting the same reward, which is funny and interesting and also familiar. I mean, if you're in there with a friend, then you're going to be like, well, I kind of want my friend to get the same reward I do, so I'm not going to play if you're not going to give us both the same thing. And chimpanzees, can be selfish in that too. It kind of depends on who their partner is, which is why they score approximately as well as human toddlers do in this like ultimatum game. Um, which, yeah, I don't know. I think that's endlessly fascinating. I've titled this little section Self and Selfless because chimpanzees and bonobos, as well as gorillas and orangutans, they have a conception of self. They understand what they are, and they can pass the mirror test. So for those of you who don't know, the mirror test is a way to tell whether or not you know that you are a separate entity. And usually what they do is they'll put a dot of paint or something on an animal's forehead and they'll stick them in front of the mirror. And if they can look at their reflection in the mirror and wipe the paint off their own forehead, then they're recognizing that that reflection is them, right? It's a sense of self. Chimpanzees always pass this, and in fact, they love mirrors. So here you can see a female who's just like messing around in a mirror. She knows that's her, and so she's messing with her own face and her own nose, and she'll, pull at her cheeks, like often like how a human toddler would, because it's fun to look at yourself in the mirror and make silly faces. It's a very, as I've said many times in this talk so far, it's a super familiar behavior. So she's looking at her canine, she's playing with her incisors, she's looking at her gums. And you can do it with like phones as well. Like they love this kind of thing because they, like us, are narcissistic. Um, but they can be super selfless too, right? So I've talked about the cruelty of chimpanzees and of bonobos and of other apes, but Washoe was this one famous chimpanzee who was a part of some of those great ape language studies from many years ago. And once, while she was at her research station, her enclosure rather, a younger chimpanzee fell into the moat of water that surrounded their sort of area, their artificial habitat. And Washoe, she's a female chimpanzee. She's not related at all to this young chimp that has fallen into the water. But she's like, I know that chimps can't swim because I can't swim, and the reason chimpanzees can't swim is because they're very dense. They're very muscular, and so they kind of sink like a rock. But Washoe crossed over 2 electric fences just to get to that other chimpanzee and rescue it from drowning. She's not related to it. She had nothing to gain. It was a low-ranking, juvenile youngster. It wasn't like she was going to get favor from it. She just did it because she knew that it sucks to drown, and she wanted to help out a fellow member of her group, which is cool. So other apes, non-human apes, and like I said, I focused a lot on chimpanzees and bonobos just because the glut of the research is on them and they're our closest living relatives, but this applies really to all of them. So chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans, and to a lesser extent the gibbons. But they're deeply political, they're highly relationship oriented, they're prone to cooperation for good or for nefarious purposes. They're capable of guilt and curiosity and mischief. They lie and they scheme, but they also empathize and sacrifice. You can see just sort of a benign little video here of a gorilla and his father. And they're just like super interested in this little inchworm, right? They're gently watching it and just having fun bonding over watching an inchworm crawl across the ground. Like, we've all been there. So we can take a step back and say, okay, well, maybe, they have a lot of behavioral characteristics that lend themselves to us. We share a lot. And at this point, I would ask you as the viewer, as the listener, to sort of think to yourself, is there anything emotionally that we do that they can't do at all to any degree? And you might, come up with something, and I'll answer questions at the end if you do and give you my thoughts on it. But my answer, and I've mulled this over quite a bit, is that I don't think there is, right? I don't think that there's, for everything that you can think up, France de Waal or Richard Wrangham or Jane Goodall has some anecdote about a chimpanzee, or, Beirut Galdicus has one about an orangutan, or Diane Fossey has talked about gorillas. Someone's got an anecdote of a great ape doing exactly that. So what about their cognitive ability, right? Because I know what you're thinking. You're out there and you're like, well, duh, it's language, right? Humans speak and other apes don't speak. So I'd like to take a minute and talk about speech. Because speech, if it evolved, and when we talk about evolution, right, so far I've just been talking about like, are humans apes and are we related to these other apes? But in a moment, we're going to get to this idea of like, do we descend from other apes? Have we evolved from other apes over long periods of time? And, evolution is sort of basically defined, it's a change in an allelic frequency in a population over time, right? It's morphologic or physical change over geologic time in the grand scale, in your sort of quote unquote macroevolutionary sense. So we would expect then that if humans speak, that should be, from an evolutionary perspective, something that evolved over time. So we should expect to see that there are traces of this, more basal versions of our capabilities than other primates today even. And in fact, that's what we see. So geladas, which are those Ethiopian highland baboons, although they're not actually baboons, they're they're members of Therapithecus, the genus Therapithecus. They have vocalization patterns that are super simple. They're some of the simplest within the catarrhine monkeys, the catarrhine primates rather. But their vocalizations nevertheless follow Zipf's and Menzerath's laws. These are linguistic laws. They're laws that govern efficiency in human speech, like how we compose our sentences to get the most amount of information across the most efficient way. And their little chitterings at each other follow these laws. Campbell's monkeys, which are those little monkeys that you can see directly below the picture of the gelada, these guys actually utilize syntax and grammar, and they are not brilliant monkeys. Like, it makes sense for the panins, chimps and bonobos, or for gorillas or orangutans to understand at least a little bit of syntax, but this is so basal, like it's so primitive that even these more basic monkeys, these simpler monkeys, are capable of using it. And when I say syntax and grammar, let me give you an example. You can see I have a chart there off to the side. This is from the paper Kirksten et al. 2019. But they did this study with these Campbell's monkeys where they sat out there and just listened to the calls that they gave. And they tried to figure out what each call means and establish a vocabulary for these monkeys. And what they found out is that Campbell's monkeys have a call that means predator. Like, roughly speaking, it's like, crack cow or something like that. And it means, oh my gosh, there's a predator, everybody scatter. Because monkeys are unfortunately, they fall prey to a bunch of different big scary animals. But they also would modify this call. So sometimes they would say predator and then they would add a call after it. And what the researchers found is that those subsequent calls altered the conception of the full call itself, of the sentence, if you will. The second call would mean something like from above. And so predator from above means a harpy eagle is coming. And the Campbell's monkeys would shoot to the ground to avoid getting attacked by a harpy eagle. But they would have another alteration word, that would mean from the ground. So it would be predator from the ground, and that means that a leopard is coming. So they would all shoot up into the trees. That's like grammar, right? It's a very basic form of grammar, but it's grammar. And what that means is that if other primates are exhibiting these same characteristics and they're more basal than the other apes, it means that the very root of language is a lot older than just the common ancestor that we share with chimpanzees, or the one that us and chimps share with gorillas, or that all of us share with orangutans. It probably existed in the common ancestor between all monkeys, like 30 million years ago, the very basic roots of language. And, it's worth noting too that chimpanzees, like human toddlers, communicate a lot with gestures because they have these very dexterous hands. So you can see in that video down there, chimpanzees know that when you stick out your hand, you're saying give. The provisioners are throwing these mangoes to these chimps. They're holding out their hand like, okay, well, I want one, right? And they wait for a mango to be thrown to them. I think those are mangoes. But what's really cool about this is those gestures are innate, and they have a 90% overlap with gestures that human toddlers pick up. So there's this gestural basis that we share with chimpanzees, of like these gestures that mean things that if you did this to a chimp, they would understand that that's what you mean, right? Like, you don't have to teach them, which is really cool. Of course, other apes use tools, because some people would say, well, it's the fact that we're having this conversation over high-tech technology. That's what separates us from other apes. We use computers and they don't. And whenever somebody says that, I want to be like, can you build a computer? Because I can't, right? Like, could you even build a flint-knapped tool? I couldn't, not well, at the very least. A lot of the tools that we use are because we have cultural accumulation of knowledge, right? It's not that one of us is that much smarter than chimpanzees. It's that collectively we've been writing it down so that we can learn, and we don't have to invent Newtonian physics every time we want to discover something new about the field of physics today, right? So we can ask the question then, well, do they use tools at all? Because I would propose that that's the question. Are we the only tool users? And you can see on your screen right now, the answer is no. Chimpanzees, of course, are a classic example. They crack open nuts with rocks. They utilize spears when they're hunting. That was one that's more recent that a lot of people don't know about. But chimps will sharpen sticks with their teeth, and they'll use them to gouge bush babies, to skewer bush babies, these smaller strepsirrhine primates that are in holes that chimpanzees' fat hands can't reach. So they'll be like, well, I can't reach it, but my sharp stick can. So they'll sharpen it with their teeth and stick it in there to kill the bush baby and then eat it. But chimps aren't the only ones using cool tools, right? And while they do use many that are very, very cool, and I could list them for you today, It's worth noting too that they're not the only ones. I told you about gorillas, how they use sticks to measure the depth of water to see if it's safe to cross. But that orangutan with that big face wound that you can see was published on just last year. And he used a medicated plant that he chewed up and packed in that wound that has like healing properties that local tribes in that area have been using for a very long time. And when I say they have healing properties, I mean they are actual medicinal plants that help accelerate healing. They're not like woo, homeopathic. It's an actual useful medical plant that's being used by an ape that's figured out that your wound is going to heal faster if you pack it with a poultice. That's crazy, right? And maybe he figured this out himself, or maybe he learned it from watching humans. But the fact of the matter is, he was able to make that association. So a lot of our behaviors are very old indeed. And of course, you can ask, like, do they understand mortality? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. This is an interesting picture. This is a chimpanzee who died, right? And if you know anything about chimpanzees, you know that something that they never do is gather like this and act dead quiet as they wheel out this deceased chimpanzee. It's a very bizarre behavior that lets us know that the chimpanzees at the very least understand that something is wrong, right? They know that their friend here has died, and that's something that is alarming to them. And of course, we have countless anecdotes, again, from Franz de Waal, Richard Wrangham, or Jane Goodall, of chimpanzees altering their behavior to be more compassionate towards, conspecifics or members of their group who they know are dying or who they know are hurt. And I have a friend who's done work with bonobos in the wild who's told me some really interesting stories about like how bonobos act around death, especially the death of youngsters. So it's like they have some understanding of this that seems to supersede like what maybe your dog would have an understanding of. It's closer to us. So what I would propose here then is that humans differ from other hominids, other great apes, in degree, not kind. Everything that we do and everything that we are seems to have an analog in other great apes, meaning that the differences that we have from them come from elaborations on themes that are really, really old. And this is something that is like a classic in evolution, right? You don't have to make a new gene to do something new. You teach an old gene new tricks, right? Neo-functionalization. So then we can say the differences that make us human must have contributed to our success as a species, right? Because there are 9 billion of us and there's less than 1 million chimpanzees, right? So there's something about humans has given us an edge. So we can say, what are these differences and how did they arise? That's what I'm going to get into next. What are we? We are primates, right? We are primates, but we're also something more specific. So I'm going to kind of walk us up and down this nested hierarchy, because the last category that I gave us was that we are great apes, we're hominids, but we're also members of the genus Homo, and our species is Homo sapiens. That's something that only we are today. We are the only species of organisms belong to a single species. It's like that's what we are. Every human on the planet today is Homo sapiens. But every member, right? Every member of Homo sapiens that's here today is a member of genus Homo. And all members of genus Homo are great apes, and all great apes are primates, and all primates are mammals, and all mammals are chordates, and all chordates are animals, and all animals are eukaryotes, and all eukaryotes are alive. That's like going from specific and getting broad. That's what a nested hierarchy is, and that's how you categorize life, right? So when things evolve, it's not something becoming something else, it's populations becoming more specified, right? So you have all of these that are eukaryotes, right? And within eukarya, you have the kingdom Animalia, and within the kingdom Animalia, you have all these different phyla, and one of those phyla is Chordata. And within all of the different classes within Chordata, you have primates, or excuse me, mammals, which is a specific class. And then you have the order primates, and then you have the family Hominidae, and then you have the genus Homo, and then you have Homo sapiens. You can walk up and down the specificity of life on Earth. And evolution is, as I said, just getting more specific over time. So what is it that makes humans different? There are, thousands of papers that are out there that says, this, that, or the other thing specifically makes humans different from other apes. But I'm going to simplify to two major themes here. The two things that make humans different from all other living apes is that humans walk upright. We're bipedal, so we walk on 2 feet, and we do it all the time. It doesn't mean other apes can't do it. It just means none of them do it all the time like we do. And we have enormous brains for our body sizes, right? Like we really dialed that up to 11. Primates in general have big brains for their body sizes. And then catarrhines had even bigger brains for their body sizes. And then apes dial it up even further. And then humans dial it up even further still. So we can make a pretty simple prediction then, right? If humans descend from more basal apes, then we should find the emergence of the characteristics that make humans human emerge through geologic time. We should find transitional species that exhibit each step on their way to being human. Now, there is no universally shared creation myth. Like those of you out there who are into mythologies and things like that know that there are tons of different creation myths out there, and they're all really interesting and cool. But they're all different, and that's what makes them fun to study. But it also means that like the likelihood that one's got it right and all the other ones are wrong doesn't strike me as like super likely. But you know, I'm your friendly neighborhood agnostic, so I allow for the possibility, I suppose. But even if we can't have a universally shared creation myth, we do as a species have a universally shared origin story, right? An empirical way by which we came about that we can support through science. And it is that slow morphologic change, that evolution from more basal apes to where we are today. So I'd like to walk you through that a little bit here in this sort of final part of my presentation. We can think of time, of life on Earth as very deep and virtually incomprehensible. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. That's so long. Life shows up somewhere between 3.8 to 4.1 billion years ago, and it doesn't get interesting and multicellular until 550 million years ago. So for billions of years, life is single cellular, and you know the like microbiologists will get mad at me, but like it's boring. Where are the cool, interesting, scary looking animals that I love so much? It's like you can keep your single cellular stuff to yourself. I'm interested once we hit the Cambrian. The Cambrian is 550 million years ago. And for an additional several hundred million years, the Proterozoic and the Mesozoic play out, right? And then eventually you arrive into the Cenozoic, which is the age of mammals. So what happens, right? Like the dinosaurs rule for hundreds of millions of years themselves, right? Several mass extinctions occur in between even the emergence of the dinosaurs and these earlier strange critters, the synapsids and sauropsids and the Devonian tetrapods, and even earlier into the Ordovician with these weird, gigantic, bus-sized mollusks that are like squid-looking things. It's like life is cool and it's super interesting. But we're going to zoom past all of it and start at the Cenozoic, because the reign of the dinosaurs comes to an abrupt halt when a giant asteroid, approximately 6 miles long, zooming at the speed of a bullet, right? So we're talking about a chunk of rock the size of Mount Everest going at the speed of a bullet, slams into the Yucatan Peninsula, right? Which is just chock full of sulfur. It throws all of this up into the air, boils half of the planet and blocks out the sun on the other half, and leads to the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. But what survives, of course, is our avian dinosaurs, countless arthropods, countless fish, many species that I'm just going to kind of skip over, or rather clades that I'm just going to skip over here, because I want to get to the mammals, right, which are another group that survived. People often think that mammals kind of evolved like after the dinosaurs, but mammals show up kind of in the Jurassic, right? Like they're around, but they're primitive. You know, like multituberculates and all of these odd egg-laying mammals. But the mammals that make it through 65 million years ago, again, a huge rock slamming into the surface of the Earth and killing all of the non-avian dinosaurs and the marine reptiles and countless other really cool animals. The mammals inherit this Earth that is now devoid of many niches that are just free real estate for them to evolve and sort of claim as their own. And the Cenozoic is this period of time ranging from 65 million years ago to now, and it can be broken up into various periods and various epochs. And of all of those epochs, I'm interested in one of them for you today to sort of kick us off, and then sort of the two succeeding epochs for the purposes of human evolution, the Miocene. The Miocene is from about 25 million years ago to about 5 million years ago. And I want to tell you a little bit about the Miocene, because as the Miocene is playing out, right, we're in the middle of the Cenozoic. Mammals have evolved into all sorts of weird niches. We see the first carnivores that not carnivores, but carnivorans that we know of today. Elephants are starting to evolve and do weird things. We see the first whales evolve in the seas at this point. They've evolved onto land as mammals or as synapsids and as mammals, and then they return back during the Eocene and the Oligocene. And amongst all of these animals that are evolving, amongst all these mammals that are evolving and taking these new niches and getting big and growing these bizarre specializations, we see the emergence of the apes. So apes, as hopefully, and you are now familiar with, are very specific types of primates with big brains. They grow up slow, right? But they descend from more basal monkeys. And so initially they look a whole lot like monkeys, right? So you can see on the left there, that's a skeleton of Ikembo hesleni, which is a specific type of Miocene ape that lived about 20, let's call it 21 million years ago. And I've actually seen this specific specimen many times because it's at the National Museums of Kenya, which is where I do a lot of my field work. And it is from these first Miocene apes that show up, again, about 20 million years ago, that we see this explosion of apes. The Miocene is a real planet of the apes, right? We had dozens and dozens and dozens of species of apes that first show up having evolved in Eastern Africa. But then as the Miocene wears on and it's warm and it's humid, they expand up into Europe and all the way out east into Asia. And they take all these bizarre forms, and you can find their fossils in places like Germany. It's really, really strange. At the same time, there's hardly any monkeys, right? Like it seems like apes have sort of taken over the monkey niche in a lot of places. And these apes are like doing a ton of different interesting things as they evolve. They start looking less like they're the monkeys that they evolved from, the old world monkeys that they evolved from, and start looking more like the apes that we see today. They start moving in interesting ways, walking on their fists. They start having suspensory locomotion or hanging like gibbons and brachiating through the trees. But of all of these really interesting ways of movement, and I think that's worth noting, right, you guys, because like when we think of when we think of how animals move, most animals within a big group move in the same way. All dogs move in the same way. They run on all fours. They're quadrupeds. All deer are quadrupeds, right? But such is not the case in apes. Some of them, hang from all four limbs and they move slowly through the trees. Some of them zoom at 30 miles an hour, hand over hand. Some knuckle walk, some fist walk. And of all of these different apes that are living during the Miocene, not a single one of them is moving like we do, as an upright biped on 2 feet. So what happened, right? Like, how do you get bipedalism from all of these different bizarre locomotor styles? And why is it that there are dozens and dozens of species of apes living in the Miocene, and today we have hardly any apes, right? Like, there's us, there's chimps and bonobos, there's gorillas, there's orangutans, and then there's like a billion species of gibbon, but that's nothing compared to the diversity of apes millions of years ago. The nice thing about fossils, and the nice thing about skeletons in general, and why I'm so obsessed with skulls in part, is because skeletons can tell you a whole lot about how critters moved and what they ate, right? You can pick up any kind of skull in the woods today and get a pretty decent idea to the diet of the animal, right? Carnivores have really big, sharp canines and big, shearing carnassials, and herbivores have big, grindy teeth. Well, the same is true with bipedalism, and there are a couple of telltale signs that when you see it in an animal, you know it was a biped, right? The first is an anterior foramen magnum. So the foramen magnum is the hole at the base of the skull, and what you can see on your screen right there at the top left is a human skull flipped over and a chimp skull flipped over. And you can see that that hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord comes out and enters and sort of becomes your vertebral column, it's tucked right up underneath that skull. That's because humans, we hold our bodies upright, right? We survey the world around us. Chimpanzees are knuckle walkers, so their foramen magnum comes out more at an angle. That means if you find an anterior foramen magnum, it probably belonged to a biped. Because if you have a foramen magnum that's tucked up like that and you're a quadruped, you're going to be looking at the ground all the time. Bipeds also have what's called a valgus knee. So next to the next picture you can see is a gorilla and a human femur, right? You can see their femora coming down to meet at the proximal or upper portion of the tibia. You can see that in a human, it comes in at an angle. That's so we can hold our weight in a singular column. Chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans, when they walk upright, they walk bow-legged. Whereas humans, when we stride, we hold our legs directly underneath our bodies. That's how bipeds move. Humans also have short, squat pelvises or pelvies. So you can see in the bottom left there, a chimp pelvis on the left and a human pelvis on the right. And the reason we have pelvies like this is because we anchor humongous gluteal muscles, which help us stay upright and balance while we're walking. Because walking on 2 legs is a perilous task. And it also strengthens our pelvic floor so our organs don't fall all out of us, right? And finally, to identify a biped, bipeds like us have an inline big toe and 3 arches in our feet. Those arches help absorb shock, and that big toe helps us toe off and roll our weight through our body as successfully as one can.
Risking going down a rabbit hole, can I ask you something about bipedalism?
Yes, please do.
So, of all the species that ever came with orders of families, very few became bipedal, right? Birds, dinosaurs, which are
Yes.
birds or
Yes.
dinosaurs. So what's the advantage of that? And if it's such an advantage, why are there so few that have ever done it?
We're going to get to that in just a minute.
Okay.
Because bipedalism is hard to evolve because it's so perilous. You have to have a body plan that's set up for it so that natural selection can then act upon, right? Bipedalism is super efficient, and birds, right, evolved it for a very specific reason that is in part because they freed up their arms for these displays and for thermoregulation early in their evolution as dinosaurs. And in the case of humans, bipedalism comes on in a very interesting way that I hope to show you next. Um, so clocking bipedalism is easy. Clocking an increase in brain size is even easier, right? Because it's just like if the brain case is bigger, the brain inside is bigger. And you can see some comparisons there. What you really need to remember, though, is that Miocene apes have a brain case size of like 300, 400 cubic centimeters or cc's. Modern humans range from 1200 to 1400. Our brains are massive. So we should expect to see then the emergence of bipedalism and big brains through the geologic record over time, right? When did human ancestors get bipedal or acquire big brains, and why is our next question. So I'm going to propose here, I'm going to take a hypothesis that I like very much, that I think has a lot of support for it, for why did we become bipedal, to answer your question, Rob, is like maybe it was a shift to a cooler and drier climate. So here's what I mean. When we look at the early Miocene, right, like middle early Miocene, like roughly 15 million years ago, Earth is so warm, right? It's so warm that these apes, like I said earlier, are living as far north as Germany in these beautiful temperate forests, or not temperate, excuse me, beautiful subtropical forests. But the way that they're moving is still pretty monkey-like. So you can see on the bottom left there, that's a member of proconsul walking on top of the branch like how a monkey does. But as they move north and as they spread out into all of these new open niches, they start to move in very different ways, right? They start to angle their body upward, which is actually a safer way of navigating the trees. They hold their body slightly upright. They're not bipedal, right? They're moving through the trees on all fours, like with all 4 points of contact, but they hold their bodies upright because that is far more efficient in the trees. And so it ends up being selected for the second that variation exists. And so by the time the middle, sorry, I'm hearing my dogs barking in the background. So by the time the middle and late Miocene rolls around, we have all of these apes that are not bipedal, but they are upright. They're holding their body in that vertical column because they're hanging below the trees, right? They're using all 4 points of contact as they move through the trees. And part of why they move that way is because they're getting big. So you see in the Miocene this trend of more niches, more space, free real estate. Animals get bigger as they exploit these niches. Apes get bigger as they exploit these niches. And because they're getting bigger, but they're still arboreal, they have to find a way to move through the trees in a more stable way. So they start clambering slowly instead of staying on top of that branch. They have those 4 points of contact, like how a human climbs in the trees. And that is what requires that upright body posture. So if the bodies are upright, what happens when you have an ape that's bipedal or upright in the trees, orthograde or bipedal in the trees, and then you take away the trees? This is the same question that we're asking, like with these dinosaurs, is like what kind of pressure, what kind of setup predisposes you to being bipedal? Well, we can look to animals that are like these Miocene apes that live today. Gibbons are my favorite, apes. I love them. I think they're wonderful. And what's fascinating about gibbons is that they are almost fully arboreal. They hardly ever leave the trees. They're super efficient in the trees, and the way that they move is they hang below the branches and they monkey bars through the trees. But what that means is that when they come to the ground, because their bodies are upright in the trees, they have to be upright on the ground. So if you have an ape that's upright in the trees and you take away the trees, you get a biped on the ground. And that's what happens with gibbons. When they come to the ground, they walk upright. They don't walk on all fours. They move like that gibbon that you can see there. And that drawing that you see on the left is Danuvius guggenmossi, a very late member of the Miocene ape group. And this thing looks a lot like something that is moving with an upright body posture in the trees. They've got long arms, but they also have long legs, and they have a more anterior forwardly placed foramen magnum. So what this would mean then, right, is that if true, humans didn't evolve from a knuckle walker. Humans and chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans all descend from a small-bodied ape that was upright in the trees. And like I said, we have the modern behavioral evidence to support that, and we have the fossil evidence to support it too. So if a suspensory ape becomes bipedal because of climate change, the first hominins then should be small-brained animals with just a few hints of bipedalism. That's going to be the first things that make a hominin, or an animal that's more closely related to humans, a hominin, instead of something that's more closely related to apes. Those first hints of bipedalism. So I'm going to walk you through some of these guys fast because I just checked my time, and of course I'm running over by a lot already. Sahelanthropus chilensis is one of our first hominins. This thing is 7 million years old, which coincidentally, although not so coincidentally, matches the molecular clock age for the divergence between humans and chimps today. This is a phenomenal example of the genetic data supporting the fossil record. Sahelanthropus chilensis is nothing to write home about, right? It's from Chad. It's got this itty bitty brain case size. That's the fossil there on the bottom. But what's wonderful is when you flip that fossil over, that foramen magnum is tucked up underneath, like something that's upright. Not something that's bipedal all the time on the ground, but something that's at least upright, holding its body in an orthograde posture in the trees. This thing's from Chad, which is really interesting. So you've already got one hint of something that might be trending towards being a hominin. And they also have a reduction in canine teeth, and there's a ton of minutia that I could get into, but like I said, I'm already running over. The next hominin, sort of time-wise, as we walk through the clock, is 6 million years ago with Auroran tugenensis. And Auroran tugenensis is interesting because the aspects of the femur, which, remember, having a valgus knee, and I didn't mention this before, but the strengthening of the femoral neck on the lower side, the inferior portion of the femoral neck, is associated with bipedalism. This thing has the characteristics. Its femora look like those of a biped. But that's all we have, right? Like, it's scrappy. We know that something with a human-ish or a biped-ish looking femur lived 6 million years ago in Eastern Africa. But other than that, we don't really have much to say about Auroran. These early hominins are like super scrappy looking until you get to Ardipithecus ramidus. Ardipithecus ramidus is the next hominin, proposed hominin. It's 4.4 million years old. And Ardipithecus ramidus is fascinating because it's not just a transitional species in the fact that it's got, it's this bipedal hominin, or mostly upright hominin that has a few of these characteristics of a biped, including that anterior foramen magnum. But as you can see from that picture underneath the cranium and that recreation, Ardipithecus ramidus is that third pelvis to the right. And in the top portion of the pelvis, the blade of the pelvis, the ilium, it looks like humans. But in the lower portion of the pelvis, the ischium, it looks like other apes. So you have a transitional species with literally a transitional pelvis, the top portion of which is more modern and the bottom portion of which is more basal. You couldn't ask for a more wonderful transitional species than something like Ardipithecus. It's absolutely wonderful.
It's so amazing. I hear from creationists all the time, there are no transitional fossils.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this is something that's transitional between being sometimes in the trees and sometimes on the ground, and we haven't even gotten to Lucy yet. It's also wonderfully represented with this partial skeleton that you can see there on the left that shows that this is an animal that held its body upright and it lived in an environment that was basically clumps of forest separated out by little periodic separations of grassland. Where else would you expect something that's efficient in the trees and on the ground to evolve other than something that lives in a mixed environment, a mosaic environment? And these are, of course, predictions that are made beforehand. Another thing that's just kind of cool about Ardipithecus, I'll talk about in a second, but you sort of send this home. An arboreal but upright ape in the trees may have resulted in a terrestrial upright ape on the ground. That's a biped, right? That's how you get bipedalism, is you have an ape that's upright in the trees and you take away the trees. And these guys are also cool to me because I study sexual dimorphism, which is the differences between males and females in apes. And Ardipithecus ramidus is like gibbons in that males and females look the same, right? They both have the same size canine teeth and they both have the same body size. And in animals that are sexually monomorphic like that, you usually see pair bonding or monogamy, which is so interesting to see in a potential hominin. Because one thing that characterizes humans today is that we are socially, at the very least, monogamous. We like to pick a person to bond with, and most people like to just, we get very jealous and we want to stay with that one person for at least longer periods of time, which is something that most other apes don't do. But I think that's cool. And also, it's worth noting that sexual monomorphism is also a characteristic that you see in female dominant species. So, it's interesting to think about this when we're trying to recreate the sociality of these ancient hominins. Of course, after we see Ardipithecus ramidus after 4.4 million years ago. We start to see the rise of the Australopiths. So that's Lucy species. And this happens exactly at the same time that the trees are starting to disappear all across Eastern Africa, and they're starting to be replaced by vast grasslands. So the very first member of Australopithecus was discovered by Raymond Dart in 1925, which hilariously enough is the same year as the Scopes monkey trial. And he discovers the Tong child because he's living in South Africa, and this local limestone quarry crew who's dynamiting this area of limestone to sell. They start stumbling across all of these fossils. And one of the fossils was this famous fossil you can see there, the Tong child. And when Dart gets a hold of this thing, he flips it over after he excavates it from the blocks using his wife's knitting needles, and he finds the suggestion, of course, of the anterior foramen magnum. This little thing is like a kid, right? But it's the kid of a biped. And this really shook things up because at the time, the only other hominins that people knew of, period, were Neanderthals, Homo erectus, which was called Pithecanthropus erectus at the time, and Eoanthropus dawsoni, also known as the Piltdown Man, which was still believed by some, although, literally the next year after Piltdown was discovered, scientists were already saying, I don't think that's real. I think that's a hoax, which is something creationists always skip, of course, because they're like, they always want to pretend like they were the ones that made this discovery, but like the scientific community was already casting shade the next year. Anyways, Australopithecus revealed to the public that, humans not only see the evolution of bipedalism first, before big brains, but we also see that Australopiths had like these small canines like humans combined with like more chimpy faces. And this confirms that humans evolved in Africa. Imagine pitching that to the world in 1925. This would be an uphill battle for quite some time. And I'm just going to walk you really quickly through some of these members just so you know that they're there, right? Australopithecus anamensis at 4.2 million years ago succeeds Ardipithecus ramidus. So again, these guys are really tight knit. And it's got a couple of different aspects of it that make it more derived than Ardipithecus. But the real prize comes just a few 100,000 years later in Australopithecus afarensis, or Lucy species. And all of this is happening in Eastern Africa for the time being, by the way. Lucy species lived in a ton of different environments. They mostly ate like a mixture of fruits and grasses and things of that nature. But what's really cool about Lucy is these things are definitive bipeds. Where with Ardipithecus ramidus, you saw like 2 or 3 characteristics of the 4 that make you a biped. Lucy's got all 4. She's got the bowl-shaped pelvis. She's got the anterior foramen magnum. She's got the valgus knee. She's got the inline big toe. She's got the 3 arches in the foot. She's got an S-shaped spine. She has longer legs and shorter arms than previous hominins. I mean, it's a beautiful dead ringer of a fossil, which is why creationists try to pretend like it's fake. But this is a bipedal ape, right? This is something that shouldn't exist. This is an ape man. This is like the ideal transitional species in the flesh. And we have from these things like thousands of fossils from hundreds of individuals.
A
And Lucy's
creationist
not the
called into the line, or it was one of the AXP shows, and I just listened to it yesterday. And it was, how do you know Lucy was just not a deformed, normal human being?
exactly. I mean, this would be a question that would be reasonable if you didn't have an entire field dedicated to diagnosing pathology in fossils, paleopathology, which is how you tell if something is deformed or if it's a regular old member of its species. And if we didn't see like Lucy's exact morphology across other members of her species in various places that are separated by hundreds of miles in Eastern Africa, as well as across other members of Australopithecus. So what you're looking at on your screen right now, this is a different Australopith. This is Australopithecus gautengensis. This is Australopithecus africanus, the South African counterpart of Lucy, another Australopith that's very, very similar and has to its name a bunch more complete fossils, including, Rob, this one drives me crazy because creationists love to talk about how they don't trust Lucy because of this, that, and the other thing. But they never talk about STW 573, which is a skeleton that is over 94% complete. That's the fossil there on the right.
I have
It's
never
this
heard of this. Does
yeah.
it have a name easier to say than the numbers?
Yep, Littlefoot. Like from the land before time. But
Amazing. I love that.
this thing is wonderful because you can see it's complete. right? I mean, you've got every aspect of it. You've got parts of the foot. You've got an articulated hand that's still clenched in a fist there on that left hand. You've got the whole skull. You've got the whole pelvis. I mean, it's got all the characteristics of a biped as well. This isn't a deformed chimp. This is committed upright walker. And this is recapitulated in all of the specimens. That should not be. Why are all of these australopiths deformed in exactly the right way to make them look like they're normal bipedal animals? Um, that's fascinating to think about. And I should note here that the brain case size, although it's not that much bigger than chimps, these guys are hovering at 500 to 550 cc's. So they would have been capable of doing all of what chimps are capable of doing and more, which we'll talk about here in a moment.
And
More recent.
let me give you about a 5-minute warning if you are getting close to wrapping up, so we
I'm,
can have
I'm
some.
about to jam. I'm about to
Okay,
jam.
you got it.
Okay, folks. So Australopithecus sativa comes next, right? I mostly just want to note it because it's another australopith for which we have partial skeletons that creationists pretend don't exist. These australopiths, too, as a genus, are associated with tools. They're associated with stone tools and they're associated with cut marked bones, depending on how you feel about whether they did it, did the stone tools or Kenyanthropus platyops did. But it's worth noting that of the tools that chimpanzees use today, most of them aren't made of stone. So the types of stone tools that australopiths used probably greatly exceeds just the ones that we find. Like they were probably using far more tools than just the stone ones that preserved. The Lee footprints are a wonderful example that I can't really talk about because I don't have time because I talk for too long. But these are wonderful upright footprints that match the morphology of like an australopith's foot, not a human's foot. And they were found because a volcano exploded in Eastern Africa and all the animals were trying to get out of the area, including the australopiths. And of course, as they left footprints behind. And you find a pair, a male and a female, walking together. And on the right, you can see the females walking kind of bow-legged there. And the reason why that is when humans exhibit that same pattern is when we're carrying a weight on our hip, which suggests that the smaller one is a female that's perhaps carrying a kid with her, which makes sense. And bringing the whole family to get out of this ash-laden area. Australopithecus as a genus splits into two different subgenera or two different daughter genera. You have Paranthropus on one side and Homo, our genus, on the other. Paranthropus is weird. I'm just going to tell you that it's weird because nobody ever talks about it, and it's worth noting. But it's our sister genus, so it's worth talking about. They're really weird. They have these big, broad faces, these huge molars for chewing. They're really sexually dimorphic, and they may be used tools, but people are annoyed by an association, and I won't get into it. On the other hand, whereas Paranthropus is specializing in grass, genus Homo seems to be switching and just eating everything on the landscape. It's like a total generalist. So you can ask the question, like, faced with the loss of the forest in the favor of the grasslands, maybe Homo just got less picky, and that's why it was so successful. The first members of genus Homo show up at the same time the first members of genus Paranthropus do, about 3 million years ago at 2.8. And the brain case starts to increase drastically, right? You have 509 to 777 in Habilis, and then even touching up to 825 in Rudolfensis, which, like, that's already double of what a chimpanzee has or what a Miocene ape would have had. So what's causing this increase in brain case size suddenly? This is especially stark when we reach Homo erectus at 2 million years ago. Things are starting to look really human with these guys. They utilized fire, they had tools, they ate absolutely everything that you could possibly eat. But what you consider Homo erectus is kind of a dicey subject because some people think that more things fall into it than others do. But like what's really clear is that between early genus Homo and the end of Homo erectus, brain case sizes have gone from being like 500 cc's to being 1,000. They've doubled. What is causing this? Why did brain case sizes explode? I think, and this is a hypothesis that's fairly popular right now, that Homo habilis started scavenging meat because it was capable of using these basic tools, just like australopiths before them, just like chimpanzees today. And if you use stone tools, it's not that far of a cry to figure out that if you take a stone tool and you smash it on a bone that a lion has left behind, there's marrow inside it that the lion didn't eat. That marrow has a massive amount of calories for it. It increases the amount of energy available to fuel a big brain, which are extremely expensive. They use like 20% of your daily caloric intake. And so, if you have access to marrow, you can grow a bigger brain. If you grow a bigger brain, you can innovate with more tools. If you innovate with more tools, you can collect more meat. If you can collect more meat, you can grow a bigger brain. So you can innovate with more tools. So you can get more meat. So you can grow a bigger brain. So you can bake better tools, and you fall into this just ruthless feedback loop of brain growth, tool use, and increasing your dietary niche. And there's an aspect of this too that you start to see a trade-off where like guts get smaller and brains get larger. There's something that we could get into here, but we don't have time for it. Of course, there's a trade-off here too, because the more if you get a big brain and you're also a biped, there's not a lot of space for that baby to pass through. So from this, we get this idea of the grandmother hypothesis, which is super important for human sociality and for why we're so groupish, like why we cooperate so well and also war against each other so fiercely. Babies are expensive. So if you're a female Australopithecus or early member of genus Homo, you're going to rely on the rest of the members of your family because you have to have those babies a lot younger. They can't grow as much in the womb or they're not going to be able to pass through the birth canal. So you have them earlier, and then you have everybody else chip in to help take care of the kid. And that includes dads, siblings, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, and other kids. And it also includes grandparents. And that's proposed to be the reason why female humans undergo menopause, because it's like, why would you worry about trying to reproduce at a risky age when you can increase your fitness by helping your daughter or your son and helping their kids? So Homo erectus, of course, is the most human-y looking hominin we've talked about so far. This guy explodes out of Africa. Again, and if you want to call all of that Homo erectus, which I'm kind of skeptical on, the brain case size ranges enormously. So does the toolkit. And these guys were just environmental masters. Like I said, they used fire, they used tools, they wore clothes, they cooked, and all of that is supported by various lines of evidence that I don't have time to go into. These guys also took care of their sick, right? We find elderly members of Homo erectus whose tooth sockets have closed, right? That only happens if you grow past the loss of those teeth by a lot. Usually they call it like an edentulous mandible. And so what this means is that these guys had somebody taking care of them and chewing their food for them. And their brain case sizes, again, it's half the size of a modern human, and yet they're already exhibiting this very humanish behavior, taking care of one another. They spread out all across the world, and this is where we get a bunch of really weird hominins. We see the hobbit, the 3-foot tall Homo floresiensis, show up in Flores and only goes extinct 50,000 years ago. In South Africa, there is the enigmatic and endlessly controversial Homo naledi, a late surviving primitive early member of genus Homo, unless you're Lieberger, in which case it is the first member of genus Homo and our direct ancestor, which I don't believe. You have all of these other hominins, including early members of Homo sapiens, Denisovans, and Homo neanderthalensis evolving in Africa, Asia, and Europe, respectively. And all of these guys are interbreeding with one another, which makes IDing them incredibly difficult. Neanderthals look a whole lot like us, but they're super robust, right? So, you can see the comparison of the two crania there to see that these guys are argued to be cold adapted, and they're basically just living these rough and tumble lifestyles, whereas humans were living a much more, or gracile because of the environments that we live in. Neanderthals used many of the same tools that we use. They're argued even to have made art like that bone flute that you can see at the bottom. Denisovans is like a total mystery. We really only know it from its genome. Ask questions about it if you want to know more. It's a very fascinating topic, and people have argued that this cranium that you can see on your screen, the Harbin skull, belongs to Denisovans, but jury's still out. Homo sapiens finally leaves Africa around 70,000 years ago for good, although people have argued that it tries to leave a couple of times before that. And there's all these questions as to like, why are humans here and nothing else is? And people have pointed to these specific mutations with transketolase like 1 that caused the brain to grow a lot more efficient, or they've argued that maybe it was chance, or maybe humans beat out the other hominins in the face of change. Like maybe we were just better at innovating than they were. I think the real answer is humans are the last ones because of a combination of a bunch of those different things. But the bottom line is Homo sapiens is an ape that descended from other apes and is not an inevitable like finish line for human evolution. Humans are any member of genus Homo, so we were not the destiny of our lineage. We're the last ones. And there's something to be said for why that is, but certainly if you want to define success by how long a hominin lived on the planet, we've got a long way to go before we reach Homo erectus's 2 million years. And, as a final point, like we see, just like with bipedalism, this increase in brain case size, increase, through the geologic column, slowly over time in breathtaking detail across Africa, across Europe, across Asia, and eventually as Homo sapiens spreads into the rest of the world there as well. we're a weird ape. We're a fascinating ape, but we are an ape, right? We're an ape nonetheless. We're a critter that shares so much with our other relatives still here on the planet, and more still with the relatives that we have lost along the way. So, I hope you've learned a little bit about what makes humans apes. Probably too much, because I could sit here and wax poetic about it forever. And if I had not been called on the carpet, I probably could have gone for another hour on that last, probably fifth of that presentation. But I want to hear your questions. So let's do that.
I'm going
And
to take some of the blame because I interrupted you at least 3 times for.
No, please. It's all on me. I literally like lectured at you guys for a very long time.
we invited you here for that. And there's still time for the hangout. So, if somebody were to ask a question in the hangout, like, could we see those last 10 slides again? I don't know what might happen. I'm just throwing that out there.
I might ramble. We'll see.
Okay, well, let's do a few questions. Rob, do you want to pick one out to start?
Oh, this is a long, long list. Wow. All
Yeah,
right.
I'm
How to figure
sorry.
it out.
I'm sorry. I know people were asking
No,
questions the
no,
whole
no
time.
apologies. This is great. People were engaged. They were coming up with all the. Let's see. Okay. Do any individual non-human apes exhibit non-conformist behavior? I guess so that means not as a species, but individuals.
Yes, and not just nonconformist in like they strike out against the grain and cause, quote unquote problems within the group. But I've seen arguments made by the likes of the late Franz de Waal that they even do it like along gender lines, which is very fascinating to think about. You'll have females that will take over an alpha male role and exhibit the same, quote unquote masculine behaviors that usually characterize an alpha male. This has been seen in Japanese macaques as well as vervet monkeys, and it's been documented in the literature. And I've heard it just from other primatologists who are like, yeah, it was really weird. Like, I was following this vervet troop. There's just like this little female who's like leading the troop, and she's been doing it for like weeks. And I don't know when, like, what's going to happen with that, because vervets are pretty scrappy, but like, last I checked, she was still doing okay. So, yes, they do exhibit non-conforming behavior.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so here's kind of a more sciency kind of question. Well, this is all science. I don't know why I phrased it that way, but I guess this is more theoretical. Someone said, I heard you can make predictions with evolutionary theory. What does it mean to make a prediction about morphology, and how can one do that?
So this was done when Darwin was around, right? And not even Darwin, Ernst Haeckel specifically put it in writing, where they're like, okay, before any fossils were found, or rather when Neanderthals were the only fossils that were found, and there was like one cranium from Gibraltar. But they were like, okay, if humans evolved from a more basal ape, then we should see the evolution through geologic time from the human condition, right, with our long femurs and our big brain case sizes that have this globular shape and our little teeth, all of these characteristics that are related to that. And that should happen slowly over geologic time in ways that actually form a functional organism at every step along the way, right? That was the prediction that was laid out. And as every subsequent fossil has been discovered, these predictions have been refined, and the gaps keep filling in the ways we expect, and sometimes in the ways that we don't, in a way that is surprising. So, predictions ahead of time with morphology, you basically have to say, if X evolved from Y, we should see an intermediate point that looks like this, and give a big description of what that should look like, and then you go and see if you find it or not.
Great, thanks. All right, what else do we have?
Well, we have to ask this one because this is a recovering from religion show. Is there any evidence of non-human primates having anything like religion, belief in spirits, supernatural phenomenon, and afterlife?
People have argued, including Jane Goodall, that some chimpanzee groups exhibit ritualistic behavior, specifically with relation to the weather, which is like, if you're going to think of something that's going to be related to religion, like before anything else, it would probably be something as scary as the weather, something that can totally turn your entire life on its head. And I've had conversations, again, mostly anecdotes, because that's how primatology and animal behavior works in general, with countless colleagues who will tell me the bizarre behaviors that non-human apes exhibit about death, how they treat corpses, how they encounter and engage with corpses, when they leave them behind, when they revisit them. And, there was a recent case just last year where Asian elephants were documented burying their dead, specifically digging a hole with their tusks, placing a dead calf in there, burying it with dirt, and then avoiding that spot. I don't think that you can talk about any of what I just mentioned without saying that it's not religion, but it's something that's not categorically different from a spirituality or like an understanding that death is weird and scary and hard to understand and hard to cope with. Um, but I guess it depends on how you define that kind of stuff.
Interesting. I like it. Okay. Well, let's do one more question. And we actually had a couple of similar questions on this. So we can kind of put them together, I guess. A few people were wondering if you could make any predictions about the future of human evolution and how humans might sort of further evolve, either mentally, physically, behaviorally, from here.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously you have to include anything with regard to like if we end up going to space or other planets like long term, our bodies are going to have to adapt to that. And whether we do that by natural selection or whether we do that by by gene editing, I think is still up for debate. As far as like how are we evolving in the present, it's really interesting, but we're actually getting like kind of less robust in the face of disease, which is a good thing because it's modern medicine, right? Like people can survive with tons of different illnesses, and that's great and phenomenal. Well, one consequence of that that's really interesting is that the average pelvic inlet of women, like of I guess I should say assigned female at birth people, right? That pelvic inlet is like getting narrower because people can just have C-sections. So like having a pelvic inlet that's too narrow is no longer a death sentence. So like that, how's that going to work? Like in 50 years, or maybe not 50, but in like 100 or 500 years, what's that average pelvic inlet going to look like? And I think what we're probably going to see too is that humans just don't have as homogenous a form because sexual selection is all over the place. People breed in any direction that we want. And we can even perhaps change our bodies to some degree. So it's weird.
I could see a conspiracy theory coming out of that in future generations, right? It's big pharma, big med caused that to happen intentionally by giving women C-sections so that eventually everyone would need a C-section
Yep.
and giving birth would cost a lot more money.
100%. I mean, and people just forget, like
There
they
you go.
literally just memory hole all of high school biology when this happens too, because it's like this. We've seen the same thing happen with vaccines, which has been, one of the greatest accomplishments of humans has been vaccines and killing diseases like polio, and smallpox. And then it's like people are looking back and they're like coming up with conspiracy theories about why all of that was actually a bad thing. And it's like, honestly, like jump in a lake. That's crazy.
Erica, have you heard of a Man After Man?
I can't believe you have a copy of that. That's a rare book.
Yeah, I know.
I have Afterman and I have Expedition and I have the New Dinosaurs.
New Dinosaurs, yeah. Yeah.
The two of those are by Dougal Dixon. One's by Wayne Barlow, Out of Frame, and then one's Darren Niche, I think. But I
Yeah,
do not
we
have
have
a
all
copy.
three, but I just had to grab this because
I love it. I
Yeah.
love
What
Dougal
are
Dixon
these?
with all my heart.
What are these books?
They're like speculative human evolution. So it's like, what would happen if humans got exposed to all of these different, it's kind of like an all tomorrows, but in less of a nefarious way. And the art is just, I love it. It's hideous, but I really love it. I think it's great.
Have you ever seen the
Amazing.
TV series The Expanse?
Yeah, yes. Yeah,
Right? They got people different evolution for the Belters and for the Martians.
yeah, and like, I mean, there are these questions too. I'm sure you guys saw recently that they reported on, I think it's something disulfide. I can't remember. They found like a chemical on one of the Kepler worlds, I think, that they're arguing from JWS, from James Webb Space Telescope, that this is a sign that's only associated with life here on Earth. And we've got
Yeah,
massive numbers on this planet that's like 120 light years away. Maybe it's life, maybe it's not. But the interesting thing about it is that this planet is much larger than methyl disulfide. Thank you. The thing that's interesting about it is that this planet is much bigger than Earth, right? The mass is larger, the gravity would be heavier. So if we
super Earth.
went there, yeah, if we went there, like we're gonna deal. It's gonna be hard. It would be very difficult for us unless we started, adapting to this and with probably genetic tinkering or a very quick evolution.
Yeah, that was a problem with The Expanse. It's not far enough in the future for that to have happened.
Yeah, exactly.
It's still a fun book series, though.
True.
Okay, well, on that note, we do have a ton of questions left, but we are right at time. So what do y'all say we wrap up here and then we can move over to the Hangout and continue the conversation?
Sorry for taking double the time that a normal talk
Oh,
takes.
not at
It
all.
was-
It
This
was
is why we do it, man. Everyone in the chat loves you.
I'm glad
We
to
love
hear
you.
that. I'm glad to hear that because I was like, when I checked my clock like midway through, I was like, oh no, I'm not. It was exactly like that thing I told you at the beginning where I was like, I did not time this before. I should have
That's okay. We're loose here on time. We make the Q&A fill up the rest of the time and then we go to the Hangout. So we were all paying rapt attention, which is high praise for someone giving a very technical, detailed, scientific lecture for an hour. That is hard to hold people's attention, and you definitely did a fantastic job.
I'm
I think
so glad to hear that.
yeah.
That's my goal is that I want, I mean, this stuff's interesting. I want other people to see how cool it is because I think it's so cool. But you know, it's dense stuff. There's a lot to
One of the
cover.
things that makes you engaging is because everyone could tell that you really love this stuff and you want to teach everybody.
Well,
Yes.
and yeah, I mean this is what I was saying. Like it's like, you know, if you don't cut me off, I will just keep going. So
Well, we're gonna cut off the recording here in a second, but we want you to keep going
yeah,
because we have
I'll
more
stick around. I
questions.
can
And
stick around.
the first one is gonna be about your skulls behind you. But
Oh, yes, please.
yes. Okay, so let's wrap up here. Don't forget to join us next week, same time, same channel. We've got a bunch of cool guests coming up, and don't forget to follow us on the socials. We are on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, and of course, YouTube. I'm dropping the links in the chat. Find us there. And Rob, how else can people get involved?
Yeah, I'm just going to give the short version. Volunteer for us. Volunteer for us. Go to our website, hit the button up top that says volunteer. And yeah, we got a bunch of things we need people to do. Everything we do here is done by volunteers. Come help us out.
Awesome. That was an excellent short version. And with that, let's hand it over to Dr. Ray for some closing thoughts.
Erika, this has like been one of my favorite talks. I've been studying this shit since my first anthropology course in 1969.
Oh my
When I
God.
heard, yeah, I'm serious. I was hooked ever since. I've been just thrilled. This is not just a review for me, but you've covered even new territory and expanded a lot. So
I'm
thank
so
you,
glad.
thank you. And
I'm so glad.
it's just so cool, and it's so cool to have somebody like you in our community that knows this stuff. That's what blows my mind.
Well, you know, it's my pleasure. And gosh, you know, they're shoot, if you could get anybody who's like actually got their doctorate who's been doing this for a long time, you know, some of these professor guys who I work under at my university or others, it's like, man, they know these subjects better than I do, but I've got the internet. I've got the internet know-how to come here and tell you about it. So I can corner the market on it.
You have the communication skills, which is essential. Science without a good science communicator isn't going to go very far. So
Plus, I've had so many professors who were just so boring when they like, oh my God, they knew their
yeah,
stuff so well, but people falling asleep in their lectures. So,
yeah.
no.
That's a good
Hey
point.
Rob, I don't know if I ever did I tell my Jane Goodall story here sometime back. I don't remember if I did. I want to tell it to Erika if
Yeah.
I've already told it. Years ago, Jane Goodall published her book In the Shadow of Man in 1966, I believe. I belonged to a book club and I got it the minute it came out, and I read it. And years went by and it sat on my bookshelf, and my son grew to be about 5 years old, and he discovered that book on my bookshelf, and he loved the pictures in it because it had all the different, chimpanzees that she was studying. And he would grab the book off the shelf and come over and say, "Dad, let's read the monkey book." So I would sit down and pretend to read the monkey book because it was way above a 5-year-old,
Right.
He just loved that book. And about a year after that ritual of ours, because he'd do this once or twice a week, Jane Goodall came to town and she was
Oh my
giving a
God.
lecture. So we got tickets. I said, "Do you want to go see the lady that wrote the monkey book?" Said, "Oh yeah, he wants to do that."
That's
So
so awesome.
we got the monkey book and we went He took the monkey book with him, holding it like this, the whole time. And we went and heard the lecture. We're in the nosebleed seats, way up high, and we're coming down. And I said, we might be able to get her to sign the book. Well, he had never heard of that. 5-year-olds, they don't know a lot about that. But he was all excited that he might get her to sign it. But then I realized there's 800 people standing in line in front of us.
Oh my gosh.
And we're coming down this staircase from the upper level of the theater. And somebody notices that he's got this book and asks us about it. And I tell him, it's Jane Goodall's book. And this guy starts like taking charge and says, hey, let this kid go up. Let this kid go up. And before you know it, we got the whole crowd pushing my son and I up to the table where she was signing books. And we get up, within a person or two, and she looks up and sees him holding her book there, and her eyes just lit up. And she got rid of those other 2 people really quickly, got my son up there, and says, where did you get this book? It's a first edition. I've still got the book, by the way. And she must have talked to my son for 5 minutes. I mean, it was
That's
genuine.
awesome.
She was the sweetest person, just talking to him. And he's 45 years old now, so that tells you a little bit.
Oh my gosh.
So we got a signed copy of Jane Goodall's book by her.
That's
It's
incredible.
one of my favorite stories to tell about.
What a prized possession too. I mean, she's awesome. She revolutionized in a lot of ways primatology. Her, Dian Fossey and Biruta Galdikas, excuse me, as well. But I mean, Jane was the first one out there, right? And she was the first one. And I mean, I touched a little bit on this in my long talk, but it's like, she was the first one that observed non-human anything using tools. And that changed the game. I mean, it caused Richard or Louis Leakey to be like, okay, we're gonna have to redefine man, redefine chimp, or redefine tool, excuse me, or redefine what it means to be human.
Right.
Because it was such a giant game changer.
It was.